This is a video presentation, Bible 2114, Bible Survey, Unit number 18, entitled, The Interbiblical Period. This lecture is designed to enable the student to describe significant changes which took place during the interbiblical period. It's also designed to relate to significant facts relative to the history of the Hebrew people during the interbiblical period. And lastly, to identify important dates and people pertaining to the interbiblical period. Your speaker today is Dr. Jerry Horner.
A person's understanding of the New Testament is hindered if he lacks a familiarity with the events and customs which shaped the environment in which the New Testament was born. For this reason, it is essential that brief attention be given to a survey of the period between the Old and the New Testaments, known formally as the interbiblical or intertestamental period. Let us notice some characteristics of this period. The interbiblical period was a long, intensive period. Actually, there were approximately 4 centuries covered between the Old Testament and the New Testament. It was an important period in that it was the period of preparation for the gospel. We will notice some of the changes that went into the preparation for the gospel in a later lecture. It was a period of transition in which many changes took place. There were political changes. At the close of the Old Testament, Palestine was under Persian domination. But in New Testament times, Palestine was under Roman rule, and in between the two there were the Greeks and a brief period of independence. There were changes in language. Hebrew was the spoken language of the Old Testament. During the exile, Aramaic became the language of the people, and then in New Testament times, Greek was the universal language. There were geographical changes. From 2 divisions, Judah and Israel, in the Old Testament, the land was changed into 5 divisions: Judea, Samaria, Galilee, Perea, and Decapolis. Most significant, perhaps, were the religious changes. Judaism, as revealed in the New Testament, actually was formulated during this period. Various religious sects and organizations such as Pharisees, Sadducees, Sanhedrin, and the synagogue had their origin in this period. Let us look at the various divisions of the interbiblical period. First, the Persian period, from 536 BC to 333 BC. Actually, the first part of this period does not strictly belong in the interbiblical period because the Old Testament records events down to approximately 430 BC. From your Old Testament studies, you may recall that the Babylonians had destroyed Jerusalem and taken captive the people in 586 BC. However, the Persians came to power under the leadership of King Cyrus, and he issued a famous decree in 539 BC that allowed the Jews to return to their homeland. They returned from exile as a different people. During the time they had spent away from their homeland, the Jews developed public worship in the form of the synagogue. They could not worship at the temple because it was destroyed, and besides, they were held captive in a strange land. So they began to meet for religious instruction in small groups. They continued this practice after they returned. During the exile, the messianic hope was intensified. The people began to long for a deliverer to vindicate their sufferings at the hand of a foreign people. Unfortunately, however, their concept of the Messiah became highly materialistic. During the exile, the law of Moses came into a new respect. It actually became the standard of holiness. In time, their religion degenerated into a legalistic affair. The law of Moses gave rise to scribism. The scribes, as we shall see, were professional teachers and interpreters of the law. There was an added importance attached to the priesthood. The priest became the social, political, and religious leader. In the post-exilic period, the priest was a man of tremendous secular power. The Greek period covers the years from 333 BC to 167 BC. By far the most important character during this time was Alexander the Great. Alexander came to the throne of Macedonia in 335 BC at the age of 20. His tutor as a young man was the great Greek philosopher Aristotle. Under the influence of this brilliant teacher, Alexander caught the spirit and the culture of Greece. He became intoxicated with the thought of spreading Greek culture over the entire world. In only 12 years, he succeeded in conquering more territory than had any person before him. The conquests of Alexander the Great are an amazement to every student of ancient history. To follow on a map the line of his battles succeeding one another so closely in time, across Asia Minor, down through Palestine into Egypt, and then eastward to the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, and even on to India, is almost breathtaking. Alexander was strangely favorable to the Jews, granting them many privileges unknown to other peoples of the empire. After conquering Egypt, he founded a city, and for some strange reason, unknown to historians, he called the city Alexandria. He allotted a fourth part of the city to the Jews. In many ways, particularly as a statesman and a militarist, Alexander was brilliant. In other ways, he was uncouth. On one occasion, he offered a prize to the soldier in his army who could drink the most. Scores of soldiers died in their attempts to outrival each other. Alexander himself died in a drunken fever at the age of 33. Whatever we may think of him as a person, we are indebted to him for paving the way for the spread of the gospel by providing the world with a universal language. At Alexander's death in 323 BC, there was no one strong enough to succeed him as the sole ruler of his empire. 4 of his leading generals each took a section of the vast territory. Of these, only 2, Ptolemy, who was given control of Egypt, and Seleucus, who governed Syria, were involved in the history of the Jews. Palestine was a bumper state between the 2 larger powers and was greatly coveted by them. Ptolemy and his successors controlled Palestine from 320 to 198 BC, although the land changed hands several times during that period. The most notable ruler during the Ptolemaic period was Ptolemy II, who ruled from 285 to 247 BC. His was a very constructive reign. He built a tremendous library in Alexandria and stocked it with the leading literature of all the nations in the kingdom. He was also responsible for one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the lighthouse on the island of Pharos. His greatest achievement, however, at least relating to biblical history, was to encourage the production of the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament. The word Septuagint means 70, and is so called because some 70 scholars were responsible for the translation. The Seleucids finally succeeded in assuming firm control of Palestine in 198 BC, and remained in power until the revolt led by the Maccabeans in 167 BC. The ruler most remembered during this period was Antiochus IV, known to his courtiers as Epiphanes, which means the brilliant one, but to the common people as Epimanes, the stupid one. Antiochus came to the throne in 175 BC with a great deal of egotism and a passionate determination to enforce Hellenism, or Greek culture, upon the Jews. He violently antagonized the Jews by restricting their worship in every way possible. When he was conducting a military campaign in Egypt in 169 BC, a report reached Jerusalem that he had been killed. Now this report really didn't grieve the Jews. In fact, they declared a holiday and celebrated his death. However, they discovered later that the king was very much alive. Antiochus, upon his return to Jerusalem, took vengeance by senselessly slaughtering 40,000 Jews, selling a like number into slavery, and plundering and desecrating the temple. He prohibited the offering of sacrifices and the observance of feasts. He forbade the rite of circumcision. He erected an altar to the god Zeus in the temple and ordered books of the law to be torn to shreds. But his most contemptuous insult to the Jewish faith was the sacrificing of a pig on the altar in the temple and the pouring of the broth from the cooked meat over all the temple area. However, in committing these atrocities against Judaism, Antiochus was unknowingly launching the Jews on one of the most glorious ventures in their history. Let us notice now the Maccabean period, which will take us from 167 B.C. to 63 B.C. The persecutions initiated by Antiochus in Jerusalem soon spread to the surrounding areas. Heathen altars were erected in various places throughout the land, on which the Jews were commanded to sacrifice swine. The first open opposition to the agents of Antiochus occurred at Modin, a small village near Jerusalem. An officer of the king arrived in the village and commanded an aged priest by the name of Mattathias, together with his 5 sons, to offer a sacrifice to Zeus. Mattathias not only refused to obey the order, but killed both a local citizen who proceeded to worship the pagan god and the officer who issued the command. He and his 5 sons then fled to the hills with many followers who rallied to his standard. This act touched off a widespread revolt among the Jews, in which they conducted extensive guerrilla warfare against the Syrians. The first open battle took place on the Sabbath, because the Syrians knew that the Jews would not defend themselves on that day. However, after about 1,000 of their number had been massacred on the Sabbath, the Jews decided that defensive warfare was justifiable on the holy day. Their campaign was not confined exclusively to military issues. They would suddenly spring from the mountain retreats in northern Judea and destroy all evidences of apostasy and heathenism that they could find, both personal and impersonal. In 166 B.C., the role of leadership passed from Mattathias to his 3rd son, Judas, who quickly distinguished himself as a brilliant military strategist. The record of Judas's exploits against almost insurmountable odds makes fascinating reading. By his heroic example, he inspired his followers to acts of almost unbelievable bravery. By surprise tactics and by anticipating the moves of his foes, he was able to win victories against overwhelming odds. Judas, who was nicknamed Maccabeus, which means hammer, is best remembered because he led in the cleansing and the dedicating of the temple on December 25th, 165 B.C. The atrocities of Antiochus 3 years before had polluted the temple, and the Jews could not worship there anymore. But after Judas gained control of the temple, it was ceremonially and literally re-cleansed. This event is commemorated in the Feast of Lights, or Feast of Dedication, mentioned in John 10:22. The long struggle of the Maccabees ended in 142 B.C., when under the leadership of the last surviving brother, Simon, the Jews succeeded in gaining political independence. However, the larger part of the remaining years of the Maccabean dynasty was marked by internal strife and political instability. The Roman period in the history of Palestine began in the year 63 B.C., when the Roman general Pompey intervened in the affairs of Palestine and brought the land into the fold of the Roman Empire. The next few years were characterized by civil disorder as factions in Jerusalem strove for local power. The issue was finally settled in 37 B.C. with the appointment of the half-bred Jew Herod as king of Judea. Even apart from the connection of Herod's name with the birth of Christ, his character and life are of tremendous interest. Because he considered correctly that loyalty to Rome was loyalty to himself, his fidelity to Rome never wavered. In the fluctuating fortunes that attended the civil strife at Rome, it wasn't easy always to forecast the outcome. So Herod played a game of Roman roulette. Whenever he found that he had been on the side of a losing contender, he quickly offered his services and his loyalty to the victor, and he was always rewarded for doing so. Herod was a man of extreme vanity, jealousy, and suspicion. These traits issued in acts of a barbarous cruelty. We are all familiar with the massacre of the innocent babies in Bethlehem, as Herod vainly attempted to destroy the infant king of the Jews, whom he feared as a rival to his throne. However, this was only one of many such incidents. Herod adopted the policy of executing his political opponents by the hundreds in order to preserve his throne. When he felt that his brother-in-law was becoming too popular with the people, he engineered his execution. He also murdered his mother-in-law, his wife, and even 3 of his own sons. The Roman Emperor Augustus remarked that he had rather be Herod's pig than his son, because the pig would stand a better chance of living. Shortly before he died a loathsome death from cancer of the bowels in 4 BC, Herod ordered all the leading citizens of Jerusalem to be imprisoned, and he gave orders that at the moment he died, these people were to be put to death. His reason, he felt, was justifiable. He said he knew that no tears would be shed when he died, but he was determined that there would be sorrow in Jerusalem at his death. Fortunately, this order was not carried out. Despite the fact that his reign was marked by violent brutality, Herod showed flashes of being an able ruler, concerned about the needs of his people. He was a great builder and a promoter of Greco-Roman civilization. He rebuilt or built several cities, the most notable of which was Caesarea, which he named in honor of Caesar. There he constructed an artificial harbor, which remained one of the chief ports of the eastern Mediterranean until the Middle Ages. By far the greatest achievement of Herod's reign, at least from an architectural standpoint, was his rebuilding of the temple. The project was begun in 20 BC, but was not fully completed until AD 64, shortly before its destruction by the Roman armies of Titus in AD 70. Herod's temple of white marble, much of it overlaid with gold, surpassed Solomon's temple in beauty and grandeur. The chief events of the interbiblical period may be summed up in 3 words: Judaism, Hellenism, and dispersion. As we have noted, Judaism as a religion was actually formulated during the interbiblical period. In pre-exilic Palestine, the chief danger of the nation had been idolatry, but the chastisement of the exile had corrected that tendency forever. And henceforward the Jews, wherever they might be living, were uncompromisingly monotheistic. The captivity had taught the Jews a great lesson. It was the neglect of the prescribed worship of God which had brought about the great calamity, and in faraway Babylon, absent from Jerusalem and the temple, perpetuation of their worship became exceedingly difficult. The remnant of the race who remained loyal to their traditions hailed with joy the privilege granted them by Cyrus of returning to their own country. Thus, it was a responsive group who yielded themselves to the leadership and influence of Zerubbabel, Nehemiah, and Ezra in the restoration. This restored population of Palestine, made up largely from the tribe of Judah, were deeply devoted to the traditions and teachings of the fathers. To them, the law of Moses and the Levitical rites represented the highest interest of life. The strict and loyal Jews believed that the only hope of the world resided in Jewish legalism. One of the distinguishing features about the expected messianic program was that the Messiah would call the world to conformity with the law, and to the law as interpreted by the rabbinic schools of Judaism. That is, he was to be a sort of second Moses. So you see that Judaism was characterized by a fanatical devotion to legalism. The priestly orders and offices had been thoroughly reorganized after the return from Babylon, and the temple services and annual feasts continued to be observed at Jerusalem with strict regularity. Schools of theology, similar to our seminaries, had sprung up in which the rabbis were trained and the sacred books interpreted. But in spite of all this outward religiosity, religion had sadly declined. The externals had been multiplied, but the inner spirit had disappeared. The old nation before the exile may have been rude and simple, yet it was capable in its worst periods of producing majestic religious figures who kept high the ideal of life and preserved the connection of the nation with heaven, and the inspired voices of the prophets kept the stream of truth running fresh and clean. But for 400 years, no prophet's voice was heard. However, in spite of the superficiality and poverty of formal religion among the Jews, there were still sincerely devout and spiritually minded people who trusted in God and believed in the high spiritual mission of their race. Among these people, the hope of a coming Messiah was held dear. This hope varied among different groups, and there were many different beliefs as to the nature and work of this Messiah. He might be a prophet, a priest, a king, or even an angel. In the hearts of many, there was a deep longing for something more satisfying than that which their official religion offered them. Hellenism refers to Greek culture. Alexander the Great introduced Greek civilization to the rest of the world. To exaggerate the effect of Alexander's conquest upon the world of the New Testament would indeed be difficult. But the great direct contribution he made was bringing forward the Greek mind with its philosophic inquisitiveness and literary expression, that is, Greek thought and Greek language. The Romans gave to the ancient world its political principles and administration, but the Greeks were the molders of its intellectual life. Greek influence dominated the culture of the entire civilized world. It's true that the Romans conquered the Greeks, and yet in a real sense, the Greeks conquered the Romans. The unification of the world under Roman rule did not Romanize this world of Alexander so much as it Grecized the empire of Rome. Even the city of Rome itself had Greek teachers, Greek plays, and the Greek language was used by Paul when he wrote to the church in Rome. The result was a mingling of the two civilizations throughout most of the civilized world. The Romans made no effort to crush out the influence of Greek life and thought. On the contrary, they became imitators of Greece in literature and philosophy. Thus, Hellenism became the main characteristic of the Roman world. One could speak Greek and be understood almost anywhere. This koine, or common language, is the language in which the New Testament was written. It was the language of the common people, of business, of life, of literature. So the ancient world was politically Roman, culturally Greek, socially pagan, and religiously Greco-Oriental. One of the most striking features of the Roman world was the groups of Jews in all the chief cities and in many of the smaller ones. This scattering, or dispersion, or more technically the diaspora, was a process which covered several centuries. Starting with the deportation of the Israelites to Assyria in 722 BC, it continued up to the 1st century. Those that returned to Jerusalem under Cyrus were but a small handful compared to the rest. Alexander the Great and his successors were kind to the Jews, especially in Alexandria and in Antioch of Syria, where they granted special privileges. At this time, Jews were everywhere in the empire, but particularly numerous in commercial centers. They took easily to trade and became prosperous bankers and merchants. They flourished in Babylonia, where there were several million. 1 million more lived in Alexandria and Egypt. Special quarters were given them in most cities, even in Rome. where successive banishments could not keep them down. Damascus had such a large Jewish colony that in the time of Nero, 10,000 were massacred. As far west as Italy, great colonies of them were to be found. On one occasion, a Jewish embassy to Rome was welcomed by 8,000 of his fellow countrymen. The Jews came to be hated by the Gentiles because of their commercial rivalry and success, and because of their religious and social exclusiveness. The Jews were true to their faith, even in a foreign land, though always they were loyal to their adopted country. They established synagogues, maintained their faith, and indeed won some pagan people to faith in Jehovah their God. Many Jews, like Saul of Tarsus, even became Roman citizens, but still gloried in the history and hope of Israel. The apostles who went to the cities of the empire to preach the gospel always went first to the synagogue where Jews assembled for worship. This institution thus proved to be a tremendous asset to missionary endeavors among the Gentiles. From this lecture, it should be clear that the field of New Testament study does not begin with the birth of Christ. In order to understand the political and religious situation into which Christ was born and within which he conducted his ministry, one must go back hundreds of years. The period between the Testaments is of unique significance to the student. Such far-reaching changes in the political, economic, social, and religious life of the Jewish people took place that one unacquainted with these events is wholly unprepared to understand the New Testament. The student who finishes the reading of Malachi and turns immediately to Matthew finds himself in a new world. The Jews, while still living in Palestine, were under a new regime. New officials and new institutions, political and religious, had arisen. Life in every area was different. Hopefully, this brief study of those eventful 400 years has acquainted the student with those developments.
This has been a video presentation of Bible Survey, Unit number 18, entitled The Interbiblical Period. This program has been produced by the Department of Educational Media of Oral Roberts University.